Charles?
Yeah, we're gonna start. We're gonna start now at 8:05. But yeah, there are a few more people who registered, younger families. So I'm sure they'll join as soon as they are done with their evening chores. So I guess we will get a head start here. And hot on the heels of Alan's Temple talk on Sunday. Debra Landay is here to talk to us about reading literacy. Debra has an MBA and a master's in education, and she is an educational and literacy consultant with more than 20 years of experience. She began working with children who experience language, writing, and reading difficulties, and she now works with individuals of all ages on strengthening executive function, organization, and time management skills. And we present Debra Landay.
Good evening, and thank you all for joining me. Just want to remind you again that this is being recorded and will be in the public domain. So if you don't want your pictures to appear in the public domain, you can go ahead and turn off your video. And so I want to begin by talking about where this talk originated from, which is, Lord knows it's been a rough year for everyone. I can't imagine having young children, school children at home, and having to teach and work and do all that. So I thought, what could I do, given all my years of experience, to help parents navigate their children's education, help them, when the real goal, I think, of education is that we raise resilient, self-confident, contributing members of society. And in order to do that, we have to teach them to be literate. And I know that initially the talk talked about reading, and there's a point that I'm going to start at right now, which is when my oldest was young, and many of you know he's dyslexic, we talked about reading, and we thought reading was just if they could break the code, if they could make sound a letter and make sense, that was all they needed to do, and they would just be on their way. Well, in the 20 years since then, there's been a lot of research done, and we know that's not true. So when I use the term reading, I want to use it in the broadest sense, which is the making of meaning. And that too is how we define literacy. So literacy is the making of meaning, whether it's verbally and or in print. And so what I want to do tonight is divide this talk into two parts. The first part is really going to be talking or focusing, on language. And I want people to come away thinking about how they use language, how language can be used, and how it's required before we can move on to print and the making of meaning in print. There will be time for questions. I have some of your questions. I will try and incorporate them into comments I make. I have a lot to say, which if all of you know me, that isn't surprising. And I want to get started right now and talk about literacy and how we use language to develop children's being in all senses of the word. So literacy development in the broadest sense is language-based. And it's important to remember that it's developmental and sequential. And in order for it to grow and develop, it requires a couple of things that we may not think about. Cognitive skills, which is the way the child learns and develops, explicit instruction, and targeted practice and intervention. And I can't stress explicit instruction enough, and we're going to get into that with language, because some of us had children or we were raised in environments that believed in whole language. It used to be that if you just had enough books in front of you, you would learn how to read. And we now know that that is not the case at all, that children must be explicitly taught and directed in order to develop what they're learning. So as I said, it all begins with language. It's innate. Language is innate. Children are born wanting to communicate, and they figure out how to do it, whether it's visual or sight words. I mean, not sight words, but sign language. Whatever place they are, they learn how to communicate. And language is used to communicate. Their understanding of language is very implicit. So here you have a dichotomy right away between language, which is implicit, generally, to communicate, and text, which needs to be explicitly taught. So we use language to communicate. Obviously, that's understood. But I want to talk a lot tonight about language as to support well-being. As we all know, this has been a very tough year for kids. Psychologists are constantly talking about It's important for children to be able to understand, acknowledge their feelings, and that plays into their well-being. And particularly, there's a lot of anxiety. There was before this year, and there continues to be. I work with children who have anxiety, and if they're anxious, it's like putting up a brick wall to their learning. So the most important thing before we can even get started is to really concentrate and realize that we have to think about children's emotional well-being, and it's critical to the learning process, because without it, it interrupts and prevents what they can do. So how do we help them develop this emotional well-being using language, which is the cornerstone of developing literacy? And I think the best way to describe it is we use language to help them understand the world, because if they don't understand the world, they won't be able to understand what they read. There's a famous philosopher who said, you have to read the world before you can read the word. So emotional well-being, we want them to have self-knowledge, the ability to express themselves, to get external recognition. And I think more importantly, when we talk about language and how we use it, it's semblance of control. I think the toughest time I had was when I had a 4-year-old, and it just seemed like everything was out of control. Children want control. How do we use language to help them learn that, so that they're in the right spot for learning the other things that they need to learn? And so that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the most important thing that you can do for a child at any age, way before they even know that books exist, even though we hopefully are reading to them at a young age, is to expose them to language and print. And the more exposure they get, the better off they are. Charles has a graph he wants to put up to let me show what I want to talk about. Okay, this is my fancy little drawing here. But you'll see that the more exposures you have to language, the more familiar you are with it, and the more you have word knowledge. And then this also comes into play when you're reading as well. So children who struggle to decode, I should say, they see fewer words, they hear fewer words, they learn fewer sentence structure and language, and so there builds this word gap. So this is called actually the Matthew effect, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and the fact that it's important to pay attention to the amount of words they hear and how they hear it. And I want to take a moment here to tell a story, which is, it's wonderful to be in the 21st century where there is so much technology to help our children, because when I was growing up, if you couldn't decode the text, you couldn't read, and you were limited by what you could do. Now we can give children books on tape, and it's very important. I want to stress this right now, because although we're talking about a positive way of how to help our children, I've had a lot of experience with children who fail. So the most important thing you can do, it's a numbers game, it's the exposure. So what you want to do is, if you have a child who's in a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, and they might be struggling to do that decode operation to break the code, you don't want that to limit their ability to hear language, to learn language, and to read. So you supplement with books on tape. And of all the children I've tutored, probably the most interesting was a teenager who came to me and was reading at the 1st grade level. He literally couldn't break the code for a number of reasons, which we'll get into, but yet his mother had done everything on tape. And so although he was one of the lowest readers in terms of decoding, he had the highest vocabulary of anyone I ever worked with. So again, I can't stress the fact that decoding isn't really reading, it's a process that gets us to the meaning of making. And so if our child is struggling with one particular aspect, we want to supplement it with other things. And here's one other point that I've seen with children, and throughout I will make comments that hopefully you'll find helpful. And that is that one of the things you see with a struggling reader is that they're in 2nd grade and they're really bright, and everyone's talked to them and they can tell you how a machine works, and yet they're only able to read, let's say, Dick and Jane. I'm showing my age, I know. And so why is there motivation for them to read? They don't care about the simple structure. They think at a much higher level. And so what you want to do is you always want to support your child's literacy interest and growth by what they're interested in, and not let it be limited by what they can't do. And that's one other very important thing I want to say right now. I want to make sure that I say it is, if your child starts to read, it doesn't matter what they read, just get them reading. There was a research done where this teacher was working with two teenage girls, and the mothers the mothers came in and said, well, my daughter likes to read romance, and the other mother said, oh yeah, but she should be reading the classics. And at the end of the year, the child who got to read romance all year was a much better reader than the child who was forced to read classics. So you know what? The world is out there. Let them do what makes them happy. That's the internal motivation. And we also know that reading and reading growth, paying attention to literacy, paying attention to language, comes from internal motivation. You can't pay your kid to want to be motivated to read. It has to come from within. And in doing that, you have to find what motivates them. Again, that child that I spoke about who had vocabulary at a very high level, but decoding at a very low level, I taught him how to read using car magazines. He loved cars, and we talked about cars, and we started by reading the car section, and that was his motivation. And by the time he was done working with me, we were reading the New York Times. So I would say that in 2 years, that was, a pretty big change. But again, it was all done by finding what interested him and what motivated him. So that's kind of a side story, but I want to make sure that I talked about it and explained why paying attention to interests without any preconceived notions is really important, and not letting one limitation hold back growth in another area. So when we talk about cognitive development, emotional well-being, and how to use language, the question is, how do we do it? And again, it gets back to the numbers game. You want to talk and you want to model, and you want to use your language to teach. And I think this is what fascinates me most about language and children and behavior. And trust me, I've raised two challenging boys in two very different ways. So how can we use language, literacy, knowledge to help our children grow, to be more independent, and to be more flexible? And I think that's a key word that I wanted to make sure I brought out tonight, is flexibility, because life is very different now than it was when we were raising our children. What do I mean by that? There's studies that show that working memory, that which is how we decide how intelligent someone is, has gone down. And why has it gone down? Because we don't have to think. I grew up and I had plan A and plan B because there wasn't any cell phone, and there wasn't any cell phone. Not only that, but I wasn't playing video games that gave you instant gratification. And I'm not bemoaning them. I'm just saying that a child that doesn't have an opportunity to learn how to think and to be asked to come up with plan A and plan B can't be flexible. And we see that particularly for those of you who have or work with children on the spectrum, that they tend to be very inflexible. And if you're inflexible, it's hard to see other people's opinions. It's hard to be literate, because when you read something, you can only read it from your perspective, when in fact you need to read it from other perspectives. So here I'm going to give you some very specific examples of how to use language to help, I don't want to say control, but guide behavior, reduce meltdowns, and have your children be a win-win and develop. So the first one I want to talk about is when you talk and when you model, you want to show your children, I believe, your own weaknesses. So for instance, if you have a child who thinks that he has to be perfect, and if not, the whole world's going to fall apart, and we've seen that in lots of kids with high anxiety, it's really important for you to model for them that mistakes happen and the world doesn't end. So I can think of my own, as an example, you're making dinner and you're busy doing homework with your child and dinner burns. And you say, oops, mommy made a mistake, dinner burned, the world didn't end. I think it's really important to sort of inject a little bit of humor and say, the world didn't end. Now, what can I do? Oh, there's frozen pizza in the oven, or we can have breakfast for dinner. And you're showing them how when something happens, they don't hit a brick wall. They have to be able to think about another alternative. I had a boss who was raising teenagers on her own, and she said, I wanted my children to learn to think outside the box. So if they got home, they realized they didn't have their key and the front door was locked, They just didn't sit on the step in the 20-degree temperature. They thought, oh, maybe the back door's unlocked, or maybe there's a window open. And that's what we want our children to be able to be, good problem solvers, excuse me. And so there's another way we use language in this. So first of all, it's good to use language and model and show your kids that you make mistakes and the world doesn't end. Another way that I really love using language and helping kids learn to take self-responsibility. And when they do, and they feel that they have control, they're more self-confident, which makes all their learning and growing more productive. Very specific example, which is, we have all been there. We have a kid in the back of the car, it's 4:30, we're on our way to soccer practice, and all of a sudden we hit an accident, and we know we're gonna be late. So I will be the first to admit there have been times when I would get really frustrated and my bad mood would then move over to the children, and then the whole car sort of fell apart. And Charles is laughing, he's been there. So instead, I want to show how to use language for all of our emotional well-being, and then how it then plays out to help a child learn responsibility. And what I mean by that is, so we're in the car, and I realize we're going to be late. So I can say, oh my goodness, look at this, we're in a traffic jam, we're gonna be late, I'm really sorry. And then say, but you know what? This doesn't have to happen again. Next week, we're gonna leave 15 minutes earlier so that we build in a time not to be late. Okay, fine, the child agrees to that. Child comes out of practice, he was late, he wasn't happy, and you might even say, how did you feel? And he said, well, it was really hard, and you apologize again, because as a parent, I'm modeling responsibility. I'm really sorry, this was beyond my control, I'm using language, and I've already come up with a plan B to prevent this the next time. You share the plan B, okay, it's now a week later. That morning you say, remember, we don't want to be late, we are going to leave 15 minutes early. He acknowledges it, and it's now after school. And you remind him again, and you say, remember, we're leaving 15 minutes early, and I will give you a 5-minute warning. So now there's no one's getting excited. Everyone knows what the game plan is. 5-minute warning comes, and you say, we're leaving in 5 minutes, but mom, it isn't time. And you say, no, we need to leave early so that you're not late. Remember how you felt when we were late. Do you want to repeat that feeling? Oh no, let's get in the car. And he gets in the car, and you're there in plenty of time. And then let's say you're early, and you can have a fun game in the car, you can do homework in the car, you can listen to a book on tape in the car. One of the things that I have found in our busy lives is that there's so much we can do with listening to books, literacy, conversations, talking to our kids while we're stuck in traffic. So the whole point of that story was to say, I acknowledge that as the parent, it was out of my control. The flexibility was, I'm not going to let it happen again. I built in a way that it won't. I've given the child the choice. He can choose to do it, or he can choose to be late and feel crummy. And so now it's not mom doing it. He made the decision. So again, all of you have different age children, but you can begin to think about how this can apply to a lot of different ages. Okay, one more quick example about language is the old dinner time routine. So it's dinner time, and you turn to your child and you say, what do you want for dinner? And either he stares at you or she stares at you, or they say, I want fried chicken, we'll say. And you know you don't have fried chicken, and you say, I don't have fried chicken. And all of a sudden, it all explodes again. Why? Because the child thinks, well, I'm not being heard, or why did she bother to ask me if she doesn't have it? And then no matter what you do, it's not going to be good enough. And there's negotiation, and there's anger, and all of a sudden what should be a positive experience has now gone the opposite way. You can do the exact same thing, but again, it's using language to develop cognitive thinking. So you'll say, what do you want for dinner? Spaghetti or a hot dog? I'm just making these dinners up. It's not what I serve my kids for dinner every night, just why. So you can say, do you want spaghetti or a hot dog? If you have spaghetti, you get broccoli. And if you have a hot dog, you get French fries. And so now the child sees that there is a cause and effect. We need to teach children if then thinking. So there's cause and effect. Well, if I have the hot dog, I get French fries. And if I have the spaghetti, I get broccoli. And some kids may choose the broccoli over the French fries. But in any event, you've done something very important. You have narrowed down the choices for them. Children, when asked something, don't even know where to go in their brain. I love to give this example. It's just kind of like chaos in their brain. But now you've said you can have this or this. And now you've helped them make a decision. When you ask a child a question, what they want, it is very important to only give them two choices. In this case, two choices that you could answer, that you could provide. And in our case, if they didn't want either one, in our family, it would be, okay, there's cereal, but that's neither here nor there. You've given them two choices and they can decide what they want to do. When you talk about how to develop your child, whether you're reading with them or talking to them, and you say why is too open of a question for most people. Why do you think the person did this? Was it this or was it this? The children need the support of that anchor to be able to then reason. There's too much going on in their brain. They don't know which file cabinet to go into, I like to say. And so by giving them choices, you are helping them think about logical outcomes. You're giving them the language, you're teaching them control. And now dinner time hasn't become a nightmare. You've agreed on this, they're happy. And more important, they feel listened to and they feel that they have control. So you are giving them a way to be acknowledged, to build their self confidence, their resilience, and it will benefit everyone involved, and dinner won't be an emotional nightmare that many of us have experienced at one time in our life. So this just about ends the part about language in terms of how we use it, how it can be used to structure our children's development, to help us monitor behaviors, to help us develop behaviors, and to help our children learn how to think. Again, if we narrow it down, it makes it easier for them to then think about the consequences and think about the answer. Okay, so take a breath here for a minute. I'm going to get a sip of water. And I want to sort of get into the guts of it now, or going on to part two, which is, so we've talked about language. We've talked about how to develop it, why it's important to model, that it contributes to a child's well-being, that a child wants to be heard, and that psychologists are saying, particularly during this year, the most important thing you can do for your child's well-being is to acknowledge them, to help them learn about the feelings. And we think they have the words, but they don't have the words. And so I really want to give two very specific examples before we move on, because I really want you to have things to take away. So this was done, actually, it's an interesting story in Utah. And it's a true story of a woman who was asked to teach homeless children. And you can only imagine the behavioral issues with homeless children. And so she realized that the reason they were acting out, and the reason all of our kids are acting out, is because they don't understand their emotions. They don't know what to do with them. So again, the modeling is you give them the words, and then they can use those words. And then from there, you can decide on a solution. So in this example in Utah, she had a word tree, and she would put words up like frustrated, hungry, tired. And so the children could then point to the word, and it was a way for them to express how they felt. And then a way to build vocabulary, depending on the age of the child, is to then add synonyms to the wall to get more specific. So there's another thing, is you may have a child who just isn't good about sharing feelings. And another way that you can work on feelings is to use books, to use literature. And you can be reading a storybook to your child, and when that character feels a certain way, you can talk about that. And so if your child is, sort of acting out, you can say, oh, are you feeling like so-and-so did in a book? Because we know that books are critical to helping children and adults for that matter, develop identity. And so even if they can't understand what they're feeling, or they may not have the words, or we haven't given them the words, they sometimes can explain it through text. And so that's why book reading and talking about what you're reading is so important. So I sort of sidestep for a minute. I want to get back to the whole idea of how language plays into reading. Now, I'm talking about reading with what I like to say capital R, which is reading comprehension, the making of meaning. And Charles is going to put up slide 2, which is called The Simple View of Reading. This was a theory developed in the 1980s by two gentlemen, Gow and Tumner. It has been referred to a great deal. And it basically says this. It says that language comprehension multiplied by your decoding skill level yields your reading comprehension. Just quick note, the reason it's multiplication is because it depends on one skill and the other skill, and how you can come out with different reading comprehension scores based on your skill set. But as you will see, because Charles is going to put up the third slide, there really is no simple view of reading, and I'll explain why. So the simple view of reading was good in concept. It said if we build our kids' language comprehension, and if they learn how to decode, then boy, reading comprehension is just going to be a piece of cake, and they won't have trouble reading, and they'll be literate, and they'll do well in school. It doesn't work like that, as we all know. So this is a well-known researcher by the name of, I think, Hollis Scarborough, and she came up with this strands of what goes into skilled reading. And again, skilled reading is the capital R, is reading comprehension. So we're going to go through these briefly, but I've added 2 pieces to that. And I've added working memory and emotional well-being. Well, we spent a lot of time this evening talking about emotional well-being and how we use language to develop that. And again, if you have a struggling reader in your household, and they're anxious, if they're not open to working, if their emotional well-being isn't where it needs to be, it's going to be really difficult to do anything else. So we must consider emotional well-being and working memory. Working memory is the dashboard of your brain. And when you read words, you have to not only be able to decode the word, okay, but you have to know what it means, and you have to know it in context, and then you have to put it all together. And for an example, and to do that well, to make meaning, everything else aside, you have to visualize, and we'll get to visualization in a minute. But imagine this sentence. Imagine you have a second grader reading this sentence, and we'll just assume they know the words. And the sentence reads, Beth saw the wood toy spin on the table. Now a child knows what Beth is. They probably know what every single word means in that sentence. But if you said to them, okay, this is like one of those reading comprehension questions. So what happened to the toy? They would look at you and go, I don't know. But think about this. Now, what does the comprehension really require but visualization? Those words have to become a picture. And I can't tell you how many kids I've worked with where the study has said they have a reading comprehension problem, and we'll just teach them a reading comprehension strategy. It doesn't work like that. It goes back to, if I can't visualize the meaning of the word's not going to make sense, the sentence isn't going to make sense, and the paragraph and the story isn't going to make sense. So we have to teach our children to visualize. And later on tonight, I'll be talking about how we can do that. So when you say, okay, Beth saw the wood toy spin on the table, and then you say, well, what could have happened to the toy? Well, they have to, and they'll look at you, they have to be able to see, and they have to know what a toy looks like. So you might start by saying, well, what does a spin mean? And what does the shape look like that the toy might look like? And for those of our children who know dreidels, it's the perfect example. And then if it's spinning, where might the toy end up and why? And so asking those questions, you're now using language. They have to visualize to see it, and there's their answer. Think about how many children you may have come into contact with who do poorly on standardized tests because of reading comprehension. Words are only words until they are visualized. And so I want to go on to say that visualization is absolutely necessary for the making of meaning. And that often I've worked with kids, students with reading comprehension, and we start very simply. So I know that everyone wants practical, helpful hints for how to do this. So when you talk about visualization, a really easy way to start, which also tells you if your child has strong listening comprehension, is to read them a sentence and have them draw it. The red barn looked very old as we drove by. Okay, so there's a lot of working memory going on there. I have to picture a red barn and looks old and we're driving by. So then a question might be, so how did you know the barn looked old? Oh, and they have to reformat the picture. And the more they visualize, the more they format, the more they understand. So visualization is really important. And visualization also helps you sometimes go into what I like to say, the right file cabinet. So we always want to strengthen our children's ability to make pictures, to make connections via the pictures. So I like to play games. And this is a game that I would play with the children when we were stuck in traffic, when we were at a restaurant waiting for a meal. And it played to their strengths. My children loved animals. And so we would play what I would call the animal game. And I would say, and again, I'm using language, I'm asking questions, I'm giving them clues, and now they have to visualize. So I would say, I am thinking of an animal who, if mud fell on his coat, you would definitely be able to see it. So then that's a pretty complicated sentence. So we'll think that's an older child. But I'm thinking of an animal that has white fur, and they can grow to be pretty big. And so little by little, the child is beginning to form this picture and then says, oh, it's a polar bear, or it's a bear. But then you said, oh, but the skin's white. Oh, it's a polar bear. Now, this same kind of game can be used when you're working with a child in initial decoding. So you can say, I'm thinking of an animal that begins with a and they live in a cold climate. So you're asking them to hold on to a lot. That's working memory. And then they come up with the answer. So you're combining decoding skills with knowledge, and you're bringing it together. That's the integration that comes, as we see on this chart, with skilled reading. Okay, so we need working memory, we need visualization, we need emotional well-being. Now let's go back and look at the language comprehension. Background knowledge. You don't know what you don't know, and you have to see things in context. And so you'll often hear that teachers, before they start talking about the Civil War, might talk about, well, what do we know? Or introduce the subject and pull from what you know. I can't stress enough that if you're struggling to teach your child a new concept, if you teach it that concept without anything for them to anchor it on, it becomes really difficult for them to learn. I always teach with analogy. I always start from their point of strength and then use an analogy to show them how it gets used in the new topic. Something similar to this is I was working with a very, very bright high school student, but he had terrible organization skills. And I said to him, you need to keep an assignment notebook. Or have you ever thought about keeping, I don't think you tell your child, you say, have you ever thought about keeping an assignment notebook? And he's like, yeah, everyone tells me to keep an assignment notebook, but what do I need to do it for? I can look it up in the computer and blah, blah, blah. And okay, so I said, okay, how am I going to get this point across? So I said, and this, remember, is a very, very bright young man. And I said, okay, you played soccer in junior high. I said, yeah. I said, played front or middle, whatever. I said, yeah. I said, your job was to get the ball down the other end. Yeah. And did you do it by yourself, or did you always have to keep track of everyone around you and how they impacted you getting the ball down? He goes, yeah, of course I had to pay attention to everything around me to figure out what I was doing. I said, bingo. That's why you're an assignment notebook, so that you know what's due when, including soccer practice. And he goes, wow, it's the first person that ever explained the why to me. And all I did was take a model of what he could understand and apply it to what he didn't understand. And now I had buy-in. Okay, so always always help with background knowledge. What do you know? Quick story is, if you're planning a trip, and depending on the age of your children, I always had my children read a book, or we read a book together about where we're going, so that they had buy-in. They knew a lot. They became the experts. They had some say, so I'm acknowledging them. They're learning, and they know a little bit about where they're going. So background knowledge is critical. And you can get it by experience. You can get it through books. You get it by talking about different things. Vocabulary. I don't think I can say too much about vocabulary. Use it, build it, use word walls for older children, middle schoolers. It's great when they bring up a vocabulary word to talk about connotation. Why do I use this word and not this word? Because that's really the level of sophistication they're going to need when they're writing. And that level of sophistication graduates from the time they're 4 on, because not only is it a word, but what does the word suggest? And that's, again, where we get comprehension. Language structures. It has to do with how we use semantics, syntax, all that. Here's an example. The three words are the same. Mama, home, is. Okay, 3 words. If I say, is mama home? That's a question. If I say mama is home, that's a statement. And from those two, there's a huge difference, which leads to all sorts of questions and interpretation, etc. So again, language structures can be learned. We need to model, we need to practice. Again, exposure, it's a numbers game. So whether it's verbal or in what you read to them, or if you find it interesting, depending again on the age of the child, you might point that out. Or you could even with a little child say, well, why do you think they use that word and not that word? Or what other word? Or if it's funny, what other thing could be? You can stop and you can teach these things in a fun way. Verbal reasoning. This is so critical. And this is what our children are missing today, because this is the if-then, this is the inference, this is the metaphor. And we can teach it orally, and obviously because we're doing language comprehension, but it's that inference that then comes into the reading when kids again fail their comprehension questions. I just want to tell this quick story about verbal reasoning. You know, say what you mean what you say. I think that's like a critical thing that everyone should write down when you're talking to your kid. And I still make that mistake as an adult. Say what you mean and mean what you say. So this is an example that sort of addresses that. I was working with a student and his mom was coming to pick him up, and he was probably in, I don't know, 3rd grade, and she was late. And he was a little nervous, and I said, don't worry, your mom will be here. Mom walks in and the mother says, sorry I'm late, but there was a funeral. And the kid looks at his mom and goes, huh, now think about it. I know what she meant. She meant there was a funeral, that the cards got to go by. She had to stop, and that made her late. But in what she said, it made absolutely no sense to her child, because he didn't have the inference. He didn't have the background knowledge. And so say what you mean and mean what you say. Literacy knowledge is all about, you read different books, different ways. One of the things they see is that children can be really good readers in elementary school, maybe even middle school, and then they get to high school and they have no idea how to read biology. They have no idea how to read chemistry. And so we need to talk about the fact that different types of stories are read different ways. And, you know, I've seen it as early as middle elementary. Who's telling the story? Is it 3rd person? Is it 1st person? So they begin to understand that literacy, stories, books, writing can all be done in very different ways. And again, going back to when we talked about language, we want to be explicit, we want to practice, and we want to reiterate, and we want to practice, and we want to practice. So now we'll get to word recognition, which is what we call decoding. 20 years ago, we thought, oh, that's just reading, but it's not. Reading is, as I said, the making of meaning. So many of you have heard about phonological awareness. So when you think about phonological, what does that mean? It means they have to be able to hear the sounds. They have to, you want them to be familiar with prosody, how a sentence is, how you hear a sentence, how you hear words. You want them to, at some level, understand that sounds make words, words make sentences, etc. So how do we do that? How do you do it for a newborn? you play music. And there's music that is better than Raffi. I will tell you that. Again, I'm showing my age. But anyway, you play music, you play show tunes. I got to tell you, Broadway is a wonderful thing for teaching children because there's rhyme, there's melody, there is story. There's a lot that you can do just with a song. And one of the things that we find with struggling readers who have phonological deficits is that they can't rhyme. They don't hear the rhyme, they don't understand the rhyme. And I think Charles would agree that Broadway music has a lot of rhyming to it. So it's a great way to teach words and emotion and rhymes and feelings. And it's just a wonderful way. I grew up learning and I recommend it highly. Okay, so that's kind of an example of how we build phonological awareness. And then you can play games. You can say, again, this has nothing to do with print yet. If we say, I have a word, p, if I take the p off, what do I have left? I have at. I'm sorry, I didn't give you the word first. So Pat, take away the p, I have at. I have the word Sam, I take away and what do I have? I have sat. So before a child's even introduced to print, you want them to be able to manipulate these sounds. You want them to be able to add and delete. And again, they're not even looking at print. They're just hearing songs. And it's the phonological awareness. Once they're aware that the sounds, you then begin to apply them to print. And many people think it's print to sound. It's not. It's sound to print. So they need that phonemic awareness. They need to know that if you give them the word pot, let's say, how many sounds? Pot. They need to be able to hear each of those sounds and they need to be able to count them out because that's what they have to be able to do when they spell and when they read. They have to have a concept of sound to letters to number and order. So for instance, I can think of when I evaluate a child's having difficulty to read, I know that they're a sight reader because I'm thinking of the word spat. Okay, so they've seen the word and they know there's a P in there, they know there's an S in there, but I'll probably get SAPT because they have no idea the sound order and the letters the sounds make. And here's another just word of advice. You have very bright kids, they've memorized every single word until second grade. And it's the beginning of third grade when all of a sudden their memory doesn't serve them. And when they start spelling words or not wanting to read, it's because they don't get the code. And they need to be taught explicitly how the code breaks down. And that's the decoding. That's the alphabetic principle, sound spelling correspondence. But it all begins with the phonological awareness and the phonemic. And when you think about it, talking, listening to music, listening to books on tape is all phonological awareness. Lastly, two things. Sight recognition gets back to numbers. The more I see, the more I recognize. And this isn't just memorizing sight words that what we like to say don't play fair, like was. This is what makes you increasingly automatic when you look on the chart. It's the fact that I've seen the word pretty 42 times in the same story, or I've seen the word talk. And it's funny because there's a game in the Tribune that they give you 7 of the 8 letters and you have to figure out what letter's missing and what the word is. And when you're good at reading, your brain often wants to switch those letters because you're so familiar because you've seen those letters and words. So the goal is to have those children see letters as much as possible. Now, here's another helpful hint. Someone asked and said, how do I help a student learn how the words go together? And the trick is patterns. So when you're talking about sight recognition and the function of the orthographic processor, do I see the letters and do I recognize them as letters? I would start with 2 letters, vowel and a noun. At, and then bat, and then cat, and always say, and it's not enough for them to, and this is very important, it's not enough for them to manipulate the letter or to cut it, on paper, there's a lot of busy work. They must always be processing sound. They must be saying it, they must be writing it, but they must be processing sound, because otherwise this concept of sound, order, number doesn't make sense, because you'll have a child who'll write spell the word struck, and they might not have the R. The CK is a spelling rule, so I don't care about that. If they don't have the CK at all, it means that they didn't hear it. And these are the sorts of errors you'll see with kids reading in third grade if they've memorized every word and then all of a sudden that's not enough. So it really gets down to numbers in terms of how much we talk to our kids, how much we model language, use that language to help them with behavior, and then build their phonological awareness, their decoding, their voice and playing with letters and movement of the letters, and then writing and printing. And I have to tell you, the kids love dry erase boards. And so if you have a child that you're trying to get to understand how to make letters or how to spell a word, if you give a dry erase board, all of a sudden it becomes fun. And often spelling or even writing is difficult because there's underlying occupational therapy issues, OT issues that haven't been diagnosed. And there's one other thing I want to point out about printing and cursive. And there's been a lot of discussion about not teaching handwriting, and we need to teach handwriting because it's in that connection between the sound, the letter, and the movement that children learn. But printing is difficult. Think about it in cursive. So my youngest was a Montessori kid. And cursive starts at the bottom, and so they have a way to anchor that pencil on the line and they bring it up. Printing is very visual and doesn't start at the bottom. You often have to bring it down or bring it up, and that makes it more difficult, which is why it's so important to teach children handwriting. And on that note, I will leave it open for questions, but I realized I didn't put up a slide that's a lot of fun. So I think everyone should have something to think about. So Charles, you have a cartoon to put up, correct? You have a slide that's a cartoon? Okay, this goes back to inference and background knowledge. Can everyone see it? See? Mm-hmm. I told you they were a bad idea, but no, you had to have the heated seats. So there we hear prosody. Now, in order to understand this cartoon, you have to know what heated seats do. This is background knowledge, this is inference, and that you can have a cob of corn, excuse me, which we've gotten at the farmer's market, and it goes in the microwave and it gets popped. And that's exactly what the heated seat did, as we all know. But think about if a child sees this, all the things they have to know and keep in order to understand. So what does this mean? How do we help our children do this? Again, these were some of the questions. So regardless of the child, in fact, Charles has one more picture. Charles, put up the last picture, if you would, please. Okay, one of my favorite pictures. So this is a picture, and you can say to a child, what is this a picture of? And he might say, 2 pigs. Okay, so that's real easy. But now you can say, so what does this picture tell you? And then if they might get stuck, you might be able to coach them and say, so they're standing right next to each other. Do you think they like each other or they don't like each other? You've given them 2 choices. They now know what box to go into. They go, instead of saying they're standing next to each other, you might start by saying, do you think they like each other or they don't like each other? And you say, well, they like each other. Well, how do you know they like each other? Well, are they standing next together? Are they smiling? Oh, well, they are standing next together and they just seem to be really positive. This is what you can do starting, like I would say, when a child is 2. This is inference. This is reading people's faces. We talk about today where our kids, a lot of kids are on the spectrum. They don't know how to infer. They don't know how to read facial expressions. We can teach them from a very early age. Again, what's the key? Using language and giving them choices that help their minds develop. And that is how language develops cognition and develops literacy, the ability to know and grow and hopefully raise incredible children that are independent, self-reliant, and most of all, resilient. And so that's the end, and I'm happy to take questions. I can't hear you.
So first of all, thank you very much for a very, very interesting and informative presentation. We do have a couple of questions that came in on the form from the registration, and I'm just going to go through them. There are 4 of them. The first one was, how do you introduce the beginning of reading around the age 4 to 5?
Well, first of all, it goes back to sounds, right? So do they understand words? And then you talk about how what we hear, we have to write down, and each sound is related to a letter. And so, you know, again, you don't want to use the magnets here. You want to use the dry erase board and the dry erase pen, and you want to show them that when you say P, it looks like a P. And then you might open up a book and say, oh, here's a picture of a pig, and the first sound is a P. And that's how you do it. And again, find something that interests them. If they love tractor trucks, start sounds and letters with tractor trucks. You know, play to their strengths, play to their internal motivation. So that's how I would do it. I would make the connection between what we say, show what it looks like in a book, but make it make sense to them. Oh, a truck, a T, and then make the letter T. And then how many other sounds? And that's where the phonemic and the phonological, truck, T, k. I have to have 4 sounds. And you might even, if you're helping a child learn how to spell or how to count sounds, what I've done with a struggling reader, speller, whatever, is I put 4 dashes down, because that gives them an anchor. You want to focus on what they can't do. You want to make everything else as easy as possible. So if they've counted out the 4 sounds, you put those 4 lines down so they don't even have to think about it anymore. They can just keep playing in their mind what goes in those 4 spaces.
Yeah. The next question, I think Marlene sort of intimated about this, and also Paul and Judy. It says how to do long distance grandparent learning. We read over Zoom, we send books through the mail, we model our own reading, but what else can we do to support learning from a distance?
Conversations, right? Goes back to conversations. Asking why, and then if they stumble, give them 2 choices. If you're reading a book, what does this remind you of? When we would travel with the kids and we would see something, to help them work on their visual memory, I would say, well, what does this remind you of? And so talk about maybe a person in one book to a person in another book, or how did that make you feel? Or what did you like about this book? Was it, you know, what happened to them, or was it where they lived? And so they can begin to pick apart pieces that play into the whole. You know, if you were in her shoes, what would you have done? You know, and I just have to, I realized I didn't say this, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. I probably watched a lot of TV with my kids, but my younger one was very sick for a very long time. But I will tell you this, he once said to me, Mom, you can learn a lot by watching TV, and you can. And if you watch TV with your children, if their text knowledge isn't as strong as their emotional or their chronological age, you can get those skills developed by watching TV. So you stop it and you can say, what do you think is going to happen next? Because isn't that what we talk about when children learn to read? What do you think is going to happen next? Why do you think he chose to do what he did? Did he deserve what happened to him? What could he have done differently? So all these skills that we want to teach our kids to learn to think, to make good decisions, you can do that watching a movie, listening to a book on tape. You know, you're in the car a lot. Use that time to listen to a book on tape and talk about what you're hearing. And again, you know, play to the kids' strengths. So I think it gets back to give them things they like, talk about it, ask them why, and then leverage and introduce them to other things that they may not be familiar with. You know, if they only read mysteries, maybe give them some fantasy, and mix it up. Use poetry. In fact, poetry is a really good medium for teaching comprehension and for teaching phonemic awareness and phonological. You can take four lines, that's the whole stanza, and if it's a good poem, it tells a story. And then you can ask them why it happened, what had happened, and again, poetry teaches prosody as well, which you have to understand when you read and when you talk and when you listen. So that would be my suggestions.
Great suggestions. I remember when my kids were young, we discovered a video that was made by HBO called Poetry for Kids. And it's a collection of famous classic poems read by children, and then also sometimes read by actors, famous actors. And my kids still say some of those poems to this day, now that they're in high school, because of those connections that the poetry builds.
Right,
we had another question that you touched on this before. It says, but what should I do if my child just doesn't have much interest in learning the alphabet or reading or writing? You kind of touched on that with the idea of the books on tape, but maybe you can expand a little bit.
I think the first question would be, what is it? Often kids know, and if they have the language, they can tell you. And I can't, I once had a physical therapist who said, if I listen to the patient, she tells me what's wrong, or I know what's wrong by listening to the patient. So the question is, why doesn't print interest him? Is it that he can't see? I mean, truthfully, the words and everything could be moving all across the page and you don't know. Does he not understand that the print tells a story? Does he then want to be able, so, it's where does his lack of interest originate from? And if he likes being read to, then maybe you talk about, well, this is a story. Why don't you tell me a story? We'll write a story together. And so he begins to see how we take oral language and we turn it into print. It is conceivable that a very bright child, or a child with average intelligence or whatever, doesn't make the connection between language and the print and what the print does. And I might even start with pictures. But I would make sure the eyesight was working, and I would ask them, what would you rather be doing? I don't know. I would try and get more to what is it? Are they so anxious that they think they'll never be able to do it? So you start really easy with sound in a letter, sound in a letter, sound in a letter.
Hi.
Hi. Hello.
I knew they'd be.
I used to see things like that all the time in teaching band and music, where sometimes we'd ask the kids to create their own little bit of music, and they are completely reticent because they don't know what to do first or second or third. But if you just have them play a note and then you say, okay, I know what note that is, and you write it down for them, and they write the song and they just kind of create it, it gives them a chance to make a connection. So right. Very, very, very good. We have one more question. And this one says, once a child can identify the phonetic sounds of the words, how do you teach them to combine the sounds to actually read the words? So you've touched on this before, but maybe a few more examples.
Okay, so it's very important for phonemic awareness, whether you're reading or particularly when you're spelling. And I like to talk about spelling because spelling is much more difficult. Spelling gives you more insight into what your child can and can't do, because spelling is an expressive skill and you have to generate the letters, whereas reading is an receptive skill. And so particularly if you have good sight memory, which I've talked about a lot, children who we think are decoding and are actually just memorized every word, it's easier to fake. So in order to do that, in order to move them to print, you might want to take a simple word and start by saying, okay, say the word. Now, can you break apart the sounds? How many sounds are there? And you mark them down, you mark down the lines, and then you have them go, what is, it's an S, what is A? And again, I would do this in groups because We need to teach vowels very explicitly, and often schools don't do a good job of it. So you want to teach in patterns. There's one other game I love to play, or that I want to share with you all to help with spelling, to help with visualization, to help with vocabulary. And I have to give credit, I read this in a book. So let's say you have a child who you want to develop their spelling. And again, you learn more from when they make mistakes and you see what the mistakes are, because spelling mistakes are not all equal. A spelling mistake can tell you a lot about how the child's brain works. But in any event, one of the things you can do to build creativity, to build flexibility, to build visualization is to take a category and work with that in vocabulary. What do I mean by that? So let's say your son loves baseball. And so you start saying, what are all the words related to baseball? Okay. And then he comes up with 7 or 8 of them. And maybe you're just doing vocabulary. And then you say popcorn. And, I would say popcorn because I'm always all about the food. And then they'd say, well, why is popcorn part of baseball? And you'd say, well, when you go to this, baseball game, you get popcorn. And then you have vendors and you have all sorts of things. So you're building their kind of vision of what this means. You're building background knowledge, you're building creativity, and most importantly, you're building flexibility. And I think that's really important. It's critical, actually, because life can be so, especially for children on the spectrum, so black and white. We really need to help them be creative and to see things and to add to their knowledge. And so take a category and just run with it. And again, you're having buy-in because they're the experts in that category, and they have a sense of self-worth, they have a sense of confidence, and all that makes them better students, happier and healthier human beings.
Wonderful. Does anybody else have a question they'd like to ask? They can put it in the chat window and I can read it off. Or since our group is still a little bit on the smaller side, you could ask your question directly, but just unmuting. Oh, here comes Rachel Glick. She's ready.
Hi.
Hi, Rachel.
So I'm not too worried about, like, my kids are interested in books and they have good comprehension of stories, but I thought, well, Shalva seems like she wants to be able to read. So I, was doing the sounding it out with her, like, well, it was like a book with like sat, cat, mat, whatever. And so I was like, oh, it's a sound, like your name and this and that. And maybe she got 1 or 2, but then she just got very frustrated. And I was like, oh my God, am I doing more harm than good? And I haven't done it since because I just thought, I don't want to be her parent and her teacher and she'll learn it at school. So I'm just, I just backed off and haven't revisited it.
I would just play with sounds, and if she likes the idea of, the dry erase board, sounds in the dry erase board, and then, maybe who knows where they are in their development. And so, reintroduce it a little time from now. I mean, I remember wanting to read, but not knowing how, and opening the book and making up a story. So again, everything that's kind of sequential, and as long as she's happy and not frustrated, I think you're on the right path.
Okay. Thank you.
Do we have another question? I think
Deb, are there some specific, this is Paul.
Yes.
Is there some specific modalities that you use with bright kids that are like 8 to 12-year-olds, where all kinds of adolescent development is going on? They've got particular interests. They might take like a Harry Potter series and read it to death, maybe read it more than once. How do you approach them and helping them to take their next level?
Are we talking about in literacy development and thinking and critical thinking?
Yeah, I'm thinking more along the lines of somebody who had, let's say they were in in history class, and they were studying something that happened in the 18th century, and then you ask them, well, what did you read? What did you get out of this? And you may get some positive feedback, or you may get, well, I don't know, I read it all, but I didn't really get it. To making sure that you integrate the reading skills with the comprehension of what they're reading in context, and then take it beyond that.
I think in some ways you may have asked two different questions. So
Perhaps.
let's go back to the easy question, which is they've read the Harry Potter. And then I guess a good question to be, what is it about this series that you like so much? Right. And then introduce them to, I guess you'd call that, do we call that fantasy? I never read all of the Harry Potter, I'll attest to that. And so introduce them to other fantasy writers and then say, so, what did this one do better than that one? How probable is that? What do you think about what you read? And it may be as simple as, what do you think of the story? Like, I'll watch a TV show and I'll analyze the story and realize there were holes in the plot. And again, what is that doing? It's just developing my thinking. And so if they like this, introduce them to another author, introduce them to something, and then kind of do a compare and contrast. And if you like this, well, what did you like about that? And that might introduce another genre. So I'm not good with those genres, I'll be the first to admit, but and you know what, to everyone out there, your best friend and your best resource is your local librarian. I can't tell you how much the River Forest librarian has helped me. And you go and you say, I'm interested in this, or I have a kid interested in that. They know a lot. And so Paul, at that stage, you can also go to a middle school librarian and they might be able to help you with that. And then to your other question, which seems a lot more complicated, I would say, again, you're talking about background knowledge, you're talking about interest, you're talking about language, because when we talk about how children read at the high school level, we're talking about when you turn words into nouns, and I'm trying to think of an example, but calcification, I made that word up. So you have to understand that calcification comes from to calcify, and now we're turning into a noun. So is the comprehension that they don't get the language, or is the comprehension that they're not visualizing, or is the comprehension that everything is so foreign to them that there's nothing to anchor it to, which is when I do a lot of drawing of maps to help me keep characters. Like I'm in a book group and we read The Tempest, and there were all these characters and I couldn't keep them straight. And so I literally drew a map, and then I could refer to it. So, in that case, I might start with a movie and say, what do you know from this movie? What does it tell you about the time? And then, you build on the knowledge, and that's how you build the comprehension. Take what they know and then build on it, and use any medium you can. Be it music, be it theater, or whatever.
I think we're on the right track.
Good.
Well, I was trying to get my 10-year-old grandson, who lives in Virginia, to open up about a series of books that he was reading. And he's a very quiet kid, but he's always 4 steps ahead of you, right? So, to get him to open up, I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll tell you about a book I've read if you'll tell me about a book you've read, and then we can talk about our books. And so it was a way to open up the conversation, right, and to give him the ability to steer and guide the conversation. And then I could sort of supplement it and introduce him to some things in the book that I was reading that perhaps were not anywhere near what he was reading, but grabbed his interest because we were talking about, we were having a common conversation, even though our topics may have been a little bit different. So that's how I've kind of approached him as an adolescent. And it seems to open him up.
Well, you're giving him control. You're acknowledging what he's saying. and then you're starting in a communication interchange. So that's what you want to do, and you're building his self-confidence. So it's all good.
And his trust in communicating with adults.
Yeah. The other thing that someone once told me, they were building a library in a private school, and they were talking about just getting one copy of each book. And she said, no, you need to get 2 copies of each book, because if Tommy starts reading a book and he loves it and he wants to tell Johnny to read the book, there's another copy, and then he and Johnny can read it together. And they can act it out, they can play it out. There's one other thing that occurs to me, that when we talk about when the process breaks down, because again, I see children who often have deficits that have gone undiagnosed or delayed. And we've talked about making a meaning from language. And if I don't understand the language, I'm not going to be able to understand what I'm reading. And so what I really like working with children, particularly younger children, is to take books that don't have any words. And again, this is a way to see if they understand sequencing, because one of the things we see with children and comprehension and learning issues is they don't get beginning, middle, end sequencing. And so you give them a book, and you can have them, again, you write it. Don't upset them by making them write it, because you really want to hear what they're doing. And so you have them tell you what each block means. And again, you're seeing what they're seeing, what they're thinking, and what they're interpreting, just like you can read them a story and have them draw the pictures. And because that also tells you what they're seeing as important, what they're not seeing as important. Another way to develop these skills of attention is to look at a picture together, an advertisement, and talk about what it is you see and why you see it. And then again, just like Paul said, it leads to certain questions about, well, what time of day do you think it is? Oh, well, it's dark, it must be night. And that is how you use vision and language to build comprehension and knowledge.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Are there any other questions?
I have a question for Deborah. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. But I'm trying to teach my kids Talmud, and I'm not sure if they're too but in all seriousness, I'd like to teach them Hebrew, and I'm wondering if I can teach them to read in English and Hebrew at the same time, or am I just confusing them? Do you think how should one of the languages be prioritized, or language? I think they build on each other when you're teaching them to speak or to understand. But how about reading?
That I really don't have an answer to, but I would say let them get the concept in English of reading left to right, and the idea of language and sound to print. I mean, those are all pretty important concepts. And then you leverage to another language. So one of the things you hear about when you have immigrants, and this is me, this is my own lack of knowledge. So I never understood why you would do a bilingual classroom. Why not just throw them into English? And this woman I was going to school with, very wise woman, said, because you want to take their strengths in their spoken language and have them understand language, and then apply the new language on top of it. Just like if you have immigrant children who were never spoken to, never interacted, and watching TV is not language because it's only one way, it's not the communication coming back. Not only will they be weak in Spanish, let's say, but they will also be weak in English because they don't understand the fundamentals of language. So the strength in one leads to early understanding of another. But I would make sure probably they have the concept of left to right before I introduce right to left. In my own opinion, for whatever it's worth.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Maybe you just make circles and keep going around.
I'm not sure I own any books that are left to right. That's why I'm
Well, when Paul mentioned reading books and not understanding them, I thought he was talking about my whole college career.
Well, and it's interesting too. Keep in mind, as we watch our children develop, we realize what we could and couldn't do, but especially in my generation, people never talked about it. So I now realize that I wasn't going to waste the brain power to hold on to all those names in the Tempest. I always operate by work smarter, not harder. That's not taking shortcuts. And I want everyone to be very clear on it. It's how do I allocate the brain power to where it needs to go? So why was I going to force my brain to try and remember all these people that had the same name that began with an A? I just wrote it down and I had a picture. Just like I want to say one thing about reading with the big R. We have children who seem to have very strong language comprehension. They get to reading and the reading comprehension just takes a dive. The brain has limited brain power. And so if the semantic pathway is if you only have this much and you're using way too much to figure out the sounds and letters, you don't have enough brains left to figure out what it means. And so some people say, oh, they just can't, they have bad comprehension. No, they may actually have very good comprehension. They just are decoding at such a low level that all their brain power is being used for that. And the way you would test for that is to read them a story, ask them a question, and if they can answer it that way, but they can't do it when they read it on their own, you know that it's the decoding. You always want to figure out if a child's having difficulty, where the process breaks down. Where does it become difficult, and then intervene there.
That sounds great. I mean, I think we are starting to
Yes.
to lose people. The several
night.
people have said good night.
Yeah.
So maybe we should call it an evening.
Absolutely. But
And,
thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Deb. This is
And-
great.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you to Deborah Landay for a very, very, very informative presentation.
Thank
and
you,
all the-
Deborah.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Deborah.
And if you have any questions, Charles has my email.
We'll send them through, and we'll get the link for the recording, and we'll make that all available.
Well, thank you all. I appreciate it, and I love sharing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Nice.
It's really
All
great.
right.
Thanks.
All right. I didn't follow your question, but now I understand. Where do you know how old they are?
Do you want to stop the recording?
Oh, sure.